Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Abel Contemporary Gallery. I'm Teresa Abel, and I am very pleased to be joined here by Jonathan Wilde. And we are here to celebrate his show, As I See It, which is on display through June 2nd. Let me tell you a little bit about Jonathan. Jonathan is a Wisconsin native, and he grew up in Evansville, Wisconsin. He is the son of a professional artist who is also an avid hunter, fisherman, and birder. In your words, I spent a great deal of time outdoors as a young man. That has left an indelible mark on my psyche, although drawing and painting have been a strong force in my life. In 1966, you entered the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a biology major and continued to paint. And by 1970, you made the decision to paint nature rather than study it, and you left school to paint full time. And I can't even remember how many solo shows you've had at the gallery now over the years.
It's been a number of them.
And I have to say, personally, this is one of my favorites. It's an exceptional show.
Good.
And so, thank you, Jonathan, for being here. And thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
And one of the things often when we have shows, we hang one painting, give it a lot of space, hang another painting, which I think is really terrific with art in many ways. But you had so many good paintings, and you knew it, and I will say that's a big deal because you're very tough on yourself. And you said, Teresa, I have a lot of them, I'd like to include them all. Can we hang some a little bit more salon style, things a little more stacked? And we did it, and I think it's actually great because the title, As I See It, is about your world and the way you see it. And I think when you come into the space, you really feel this way.
Yeah, no, I think it looks very nice like this.
So tell us about the title of the show, maybe it's obvious, but do you want to speak on that a little bit?
Well, for those of you who don't know me personally anyway, I've lived in the same old farmhouse, that one, with the mourning doves, for 54 years in another couple weeks. As soon as I finished my last exam, I got the hell out of Madison. We had found myself and four other guys had found this old farmhouse near Belleville. And, it was the 60s. What can I say? Well, 70 actually, but the end of the 60s. And, we're a bunch of hippies, and we moved out there, and it was going to be a big party, and everybody was going to have a great time. But that's when I started painting, and I just fell in love with it and have been in that same spot ever since. And it's an area that near where I grew up and very familiar to me, and just landscape wise or geology wise, I guess, maybe between the extremes and the edge of the glaciated, unglaciated country. So I never felt like I had any real reason to. It always served my purpose, and I will put a good word into my. Actually, I'm now renting from the granddaughter of my original landlord. And he grew up there and actually went to college in Madison as a boy, took the horse and buggy into Belleville, got on the train on Sunday night, took the train to Madison, came home on Friday afternoon on the train, got in the horse and buggy, and drove home and did chores all weekend. Pretty amazing when you think about that lapse in time. But anyway, they've been very generous to me in allowing me to stay there all these years. And they have a sense of family history, so they've kept the place. They haven't sold it. But getting to your, my world is just right there. It's in the floodplain of the Sugar River or just above it. And so it's mostly, then to bless them, they've left a lot of the land wild. And I spend a lot of time just hiking around there and in the general area of Evansville, Belleville, and Glarus, where I tromped around with my dad when we were doing the things we did. And so most of what I'm painting is either reminding me of things I did as a boy or are in places that I am now, and I see things that it's just, oh, yeah, there's painting, but so it's more how I see a small area rather than the larger context of of the United States, for instance, or the world for that matter. And I find there's ever so much more to do than I'm going to have time to do. I mean, I don't need to, I don't go to the mountains or go to the whatever. I mean, I do spend time out west, but it's not for painting for the most part, it's for other things. And there's just no shortage between seasons, which I love, and time of day, morning, evening, middle of the day for that matter, weather, they're just the same. Well, like Monet painted, the same thing day in and day out because the weather changed and it looked different. And certainly that's somewhat the case for me. Yeah. A lot of what and maybe you want to keep asking questions, you don't need to just keep that one.
Close.
Okay. Well, a number of things are parts of my history, like I said. So there's some of the apple paintings. There's an orchard painting, and the apples are one's my grandfather's orchard. Another one is an orchard of people that live near Cooksville. Were friends of my family, and I spent a lot of time there as a boy. So I tend to be attracted to places where I spend time, not necessarily now, but as a youth as well.
And somehow I think getting ready to talk to you and thinking about our history and how long I've known you, and then thinking about how long you've painted. Your father was a professional artist, so maybe you had a clear idea of what that entailed. I'm sure you did than most people. Although your father was also an academic, so his life as an artist now is somewhat different than you. But not that you haven't done a little bit of teaching, but that's different. You aren't in the university system. Do you think that what you thought your life would be like at that time as a young man in the 70s, deciding to make that decision to become a full-time painter as a profession, and how it's turned out? Do you think you had an idea of what that would be like? And is it at all what you thought it would be like?
I probably did not think much about it one way or the other, to be honest. More worried about the price of beer. But I did love painting. And actually, speaking of my father, as you said, I was a biology or zoology major, and up until I ran into organic chemistry and calculus, that kind of put the different perspective on the whole thing. And back then there were no environmental studies or any of those programs. It was either zoology, botany, or geology, and with all the pre-med students and everybody else. So anyway, and I told my father after 4 years, I said, well, I think I'm gonna, and I didn't graduate. I didn't have credits in anything. I think I'd like to go to art school. And he sort of went like that and said, no, you don't want to go to art school. He said, well, basically, and he knew this, it was at that time period, the whole emphasis was starting to become more on conceptual art and, op-ed, and just nothing to do with realism, in other words. He said, you're not going to learn anything there. It's not going to be any good. Just take a year off and paint and see what you think. And it was, for me, it was great advice. If I had any regrets at all, it would be that I didn't maybe go to a more of an atelier type of place, which is where you learn all the basics. So they set you down and make you draw a cast of a head for 6 months and in black and white. And, maybe in year 2 you graduate to color, that sort of thing. And I didn't have that training. And I think that slowed me down a little bit. I always had some drawing skills, probably inherited. I tend to believe that sort of thing. And loved to draw. And I painted with watercolors for probably the first 10 years that I painted. Mostly because it was I spent a lot. They were very tight watercolors. They weren't like some people think of as the looser watercolors. And they were all drawn out in pencil first. If I did a watercolor this big, I might draw on it for 2 or 3 days before I even started painting. But anyway, I slowly learned some of the academic sides of it.
Yes.
No, I didn't. I had no idea that I'd be doing it, and staying in the same place for that matter. I knew I liked that place, but what are the odds? Seeing people would own it and not kick me out or whatever,
So there's a question I was wanting to ask, but because something you just said makes me want to ask you right now. Um, when you talked about thinking perhaps if you had studied in that atelier style, I think there's lots of us as artists who feel that way. I know I went to university and I have my Bachelor of Fine Arts, but the painting instructors that I studied under were not interested in realism. And then I did a study abroad program in Florence, and I was in advanced painting credit wise, but everybody else from Europe had sort of studied that way. So I was horrified and embarrassed because I felt like I didn't know those foundational things. But then I heard something recently, I don't remember who said it, but they said our mistakes become our style. And I wonder in some way, it's not that I think you can do both things, and they all work out great, but if you had done that, because I guess what it's making me think is the question I had is there's something about your work. So for people who don't know, Jonathan, paints most of the work in plein air. So he's out on location, and you're trying to capture the place around you, which is what you've talked about today. But I don't know whether you realize it or not, but there's something else that's going on in them, and there's like sort of sometimes a sense of hyperrealism, or it almost feels like it's an other place. Is that intentional? Do you know you're doing that? And I feel like that's your style that you developed. And maybe it's a good thing that didn't get sort of washed out of you if you had been overly trained. Does this question make any sense?
Yes, it does. And I suspect that there's some truth to it. That,
okay.
Because it's not intentional for the most part. I have an idea. I see something that I want to paint or think of something, as the case may be, and it just comes out that way. I don't design it to be the way it is necessarily. Yeah. I mean, I think about composition and I think about color and light and all the basics, but no. So a lot of them do have sort of an odd, maybe a little bit of a tiny bit of oddness to them.
In a really good way, like in a really great way, actually. But I think that's why people are so attracted to them, because it's not, you're not just making a photo representation of something. There's something that's truly inherent in you and your vision of how you see the world. I guess that's what's so fascinating about, the fact that artists continue to paint landscape paintings. Why do we continue to paint landscape paintings? But you do, and your work is an example of why we do, because then I can go back up in the world and see the world as you see it.
It's interesting you say that, because often I will see a sky or a landscape or some sort of mood in the countryside, and I think of another artist.
Yes.
I think, oh, there's a, and blah blah blah,
Right.
But absolutely, and I think that's not that unusual for people that pay attention to whatever, not just the outdoors. It can be people for that matter. Yeah. But oh, there's a Degas, or so.
Yeah. So your art practice, well, maybe we've already talked enough about this, but your art practice is so much of this place of Wisconsin. You do travel a little bit.
Yeah.
And very, very, in a very specific location in Wisconsin. And it's also so interwoven in your life. Also because I know, the studio is in your house, your every day is your painting.
Yeah, very much.
It's such an interest. I guess maybe that's more of a comment. I don't know if you can.
Well, I mean, again, father being a bird watcher and me being an impressionable kid who, like my dad, when we went birding, and so birds became a big part of my world in general, and also the flip side of it, the natural history side of it, so the environment. And I've been active that way as well as just painting. I mean, I've been involved in prairies and prairie restoration, that sort of thing. And a lot of, even though I wasn't a professional, I got either invited or asked or whatever to work on different research projects mostly with birds of prey, to some extent with some other birds, but I've done a lot of that in my life as well. So as a volunteer, not as a paid professional, just because I love the birds and I love being in the places they live. It's most of them live in pretty nice places.
Yeah. I want to talk about a couple of specific paintings in the show. if that's
Sure.
okay. That I think speak to, they seem like they're very, I mean, they're all personal. One of them is this painting. And I know there's some very specific things about it. So let's start by talking about this painting.
Well, it's an homage to my father, basically, who, as I believe he was still a student when he painted actually a quite large landscape that I still have, or my daughter has, I guess now, hangs in her house, which is the house my dad used to live in Crystal, or just outside of it. Of a landscape, like a table it had a pitcher and a couple of branches, and it had a couple of squash. And there was a landscape in the background with a man walking across the fields, and it had a sort of stormy, dark November type sky with a few ducks flying through it. And that painting always hung in my mother's parents' house, my maternal grandparents' house in Madison. And I just, even as a kid, I would come in and I would look at that painting, and I just sort of wanted to be there where that was taking place. And it's so I just wanted to do something as sort of a way to pay tribute to that painting. And I love winter squash, and I love the colors as well. But I wanted to use those in a still life type situation, but yet not just a straight still life like a couple of the other ones in the show, but with the landscape.
Well, I grew up not with artists for parents, and so when I first saw art as a child, it seemed like this magical, amazing thing. So your dad being such a good painter, did it also seem magical to you, or was it just kind of like, yeah, that's what people do, they make great paintings?
Well, I don't know if I ever thought that. A lot of I don't know how many of you know my father's work, but a lot of it's pretty sort of magic realism. It's fanciful, very fanciful. A lot of nude ladies flying through the sky and things like that. Which, to be honest, outside of maybe some curiosity as a young man, I wasn't attracted to it. But the warm natural history, because he used to do quite a few sort of land. We'd go off and he'd paint, but they were wash drawings, pencil and ink and watercolor, maybe, of just landscapes.
So even in his work, he preferred.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, that's what I was attracted to.
Yeah.
And I think partly it was because of the time we spent outdoors and how much I loved doing that sort of thing. Yeah. And probably I loved it as much because I was doing it with my father. There's some intermingling there for sure.
Yeah. And then there's another painting that has a history with your father. It's the coffee grinder painting.
Actually, that one's not quite as much with my father, except he married my mother.
Yes. You're right, because he didn't even paint it or anything. Okay.
No.
Skip your dad. Let's go to your mom.
It was my mother grew up on the edge of Madison, and my grandfather had there were about 3 or 4 acres there, and he had huge gardens. I think at one point he had 80 some different species of irises, an apple orchard, bees, the whole ball of wax. And he was a math professor. He taught at the college, or not professor, teacher. And but anyway, and they were Quakers on top of it all. And I love my maternal grandparents so much. I spent a lot of time there as a boy. And my grandfather's habit was he was a night owl, and he would along about 7 or 8 o'clock at night. He drank coffee, I imagine, during his day too. But I can remember he would get out his grinder, grind his coffee beans, A&P coffee at the time, which is probably 8 o'clock coffee now, and then throw it in a pot and boil it. And then he'd throw some eggshells in to pull the ground. The albumin, I guess, in the eggs pulls the grounds down to some extent, or adheres to them, and it clarifies the coffee, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But anyway, that was his coffee grinder, and I ended up with it. My aunts were kind enough to give it to me. And so the purpose of the eggs, of course, is the eggshell that went along with the brewing isn't quite the right word when you're boiling coffee, but cowboy coffee is what it was. And then he would stay up and write letters. He was a tremendous correspondent. People here and there and everywhere. And one of my father's friends, a Chicago artist by the name of Gertrude Abercrombie, who's actually become quite famous in circles. She was somewhat of a surrealist, not somewhat. I think we call her a surrealist.
Yeah.
And there was a circle of artists that my dad was fairly close to, and she liked my grandparents, spent some time there, and did a similar painting of his. So it's sort of, and again, it's a little bit of an homage to her as well as to my grandfather. In a way, it's a portrait of my grandfather. Because I
After you
have
talk
to take a circuitous route.
Yeah. For anybody interested, Jonathan's whole show, the pictures, if people are watching this video later as well, the show is online, so you can see the whole show. But also, when you told me that about that painting, I looked up Abercrombie and coffee grinder painting. You can find it online to see.
Yeah, it's a real thing. I'm not making it up.
Yeah, it's also just interesting.
Yeah.
To see it.
Yeah.
Quite a famous coffee grinder now.
But anyway, that's the story behind that. And again, that's just the personal part of the one with the apples and the nuthatch is some photos I took of my grandfather's orchard when it was still there. It's not anymore, but things like that. There's all streams I used to hike around, fish in as a boy. I don't fish anymore, but the streams are still there and they're beautiful. So
yeah. Something else I think about is, when you're a young artist, you think about sort of what's trendy or what's you didn't.
Probably
we
not.
don't all. You did not. But there's a lot of what's happening, what you think you can sell. And if you're lucky, you'll have a good instructor who will tell you to paint what it is that you love, and the market will is always changing, and eventually you'll be able to sell your work, or you'll find the people who love your work. And I think you're a good example of letting people know that you really should just paint what you love, and the people who love what you're painting or are attracted to that same aesthetic will find you. It's interesting now because like when I was studying in the late 80s and early 90s, figurative painting was not in fashion. No one wanted to teach it. I had some instructors actually say, "Oh, can you believe she's still painting the figure?" As if I had lost half of my grade. But you continue to do what you do, which at times I'm sure made you feel like you were out of time. Or maybe not, but
no,
now realism is popular again. There are a lot of people learning how to paint realistically. It's really interesting.
Well, there is, and especially plein air painting.
Yes, it's popular.
I mean, good God. Well, there are published magazines that are, you pick one up and there's 200 different people advertising in it, and to some extent there's some. Well, some of them are very talented people and doing incredible jobs, but there's a similarity to a lot of it that, like maybe the same way there was a similarity to painting in the 1500s.
No, I'm sure. Absolutely.
So I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily.
Yeah. Yes.
And there's some incredibly talented people doing it. So. Yeah.
Well, I think we should let other people ask some questions now.
If there are any, sure.
I was going to ask you, John, who do you consider contemporaries?
Well, some of the people that I know, I guess, I mean, either locally, Ms. Norsetter, Teresa, some of the people that show here, certainly some of the other artists. Not that they're painting in the same style, but, and I've had, Teresa mentioned earlier about having shows in the gallery. I've shown I had a two-person show with Sue Medeiros that paints here and we call it wild and domestic. She does mostly domestic animals. And I had one with Kelly Hotman that we call Predators and Prey. And so I love working with other artists that way. I did one with Ms. Orlowski over there with buildings. And but I have a number of friends that I've known for a long time. that we're all bird painters. We all started out as bird painters or sporting painters, and some of them have delved off. Some of them are still doing that and doing it extremely well. I can throw out names, nobody probably ever wouldn't know them, but those are the people that I think contemporary I've been most influenced by, and just paying attention to their work.
And are they mainly in this area?
Well, some are, like the people I mentioned here, but then I have a friend in South Carolina, I have a couple of them in Minnesota, and that are just doing wonderful paintings, and successfully, I might add. Their work sells well.
Yes.
What, in your opinion, is the painting that you like the most, or you think you did the best job on?
In this show?
Yes.
Oh, that's a hard question.
If I was being a smart ass, I'd say the one your mother bought. For different reasons. There's some I think were more technically successful. I like the one with the Scarlet Tanager because I felt like I used the reds and the greens pretty well together, and I struggle with greens sometimes, which is another reason I like a couple of these landscapes. So maybe from a technical, just this would be one of them. But the ones that probably mean the most to me might be the one we were talking about earlier, the coffee grinder, and maybe one of the hawk paintings, because there was a bird that I had I'm a falconer, and I've flown hawks for over 50 years. All under permit, by license, I want to add, because these days that's important. But anyway, I had her for 12 years, and then I let her go, and she was a special bird for me. So, but some of the other birds are prairie birds that I've had as well over the years. So for different reasons, different paintings maybe.
I'll chime in a little bit, knowing you and how fussy you are. Like, he paints so much all the time that in order for the painting to have been good enough to be included in this show means it's probably one of your
Well, it's ones I felt were more
favorites.
successful, yeah, or the idea was a good idea. And I don't want that. I don't sit down and paint for 12 hours a day, but I'm very much a creature of routine or habit, and so I paint 3 or 4 hours every morning, and that's my day. But it adds up over the course of time. And Teresa's right. There's I figure it's a numbers game, and if I paint 10 paintings, I get probably 3, 4, 5 at the most that I really like. I get a couple that they're okay, and I get several that nobody's ever going to see. And actually, a lot of times get sanded off and re-gessoed and painted on the board. And I really encourage younger people that, don't think that when you start out on a painting or a drawing or a pottery or whatever you're doing, that this one's got to be perfect. It's just do it, do lots, and you'll get some really good ones. So that's been now we could have another artist right here saying, no, for me, but
I think that's good advice.
it's been my experience with my work. Yes?
Lauren.
Why do you keep 10 birds?
Well, the quick answer is because I feel like it's a tribute to them and their life. I do not go out and kill birds on purpose to get dead birds to paint. They're almost always either roadkills or ones that have flown into somebody's window that people call me up and say, hey, we had a morning dove fly into our window or whatever. Would you like it? And I say, sure, stick it in the freezer and I'll get it when I'm over next week. And some people, it's like, that's not happening. And other people could care less. They say, sure, fine, I'm glad you can use it. And I guess technically, if we're abiding by the law here, I'm supposed to have a scientific collector's permit to do that, but I don't, I'll admit it. But I've never gotten into trouble. So to possess the bird, I can paint all the pictures of them I want, but I can't have it in my possession. Unless it's been, as Laura Warden told me once, reduced to my possession by a legal means. And it's not legal to run over a mourning dove.
I have a kind of follow-up question to So a lot of naturalists use dead birds to paint what we now know are like the early representations of birds. So Audubon almost birds are dead. When you're painting live birds, how are you doing that? Like, are you looking at dead birds? Is that where you really get the good object study? Is with dead birds, or is it the observing them in life that you're using, Lauren?
It's sort of all of the above.
Yeah.
Certainly, dead birds give you literally a feel for the bird and for feather structure, feather patterns. All birds have very specific feather patterns. It's a study called see if I can pronounce it, PT, parapetology, I think. Is a study of feather patterns. And and I learned some of this stuff from biologists that I hung out with. I didn't, just pull this out of thin air in the days before there was Google. So yes, definitely handling the birds gives me a very definite feel for their physiology, basically, or maybe the anatomy more than physiology, but both. And that, because it's not just, it's not just the shape. There's a reason for it all. Certainly looking at wild birds. I mean, birds all the time. I spend way too much time looking at birds. And having trained birds that including chicken. I mean, just raising chickens. I had chickens for years and years and years, and they were just pretty chickens that ran around in the yard. I loved them, and raised some. I have raised some other species of birds that, I've raised crows, blue jays, starlings, which are all really interesting, fun birds, and you learn so much about behavior when you're doing something like that. I have a friend of mine who's not living anymore was a biologist here in Wisconsin, Frances Hammerstrom, and she felt it was a sin that people, but especially children, couldn't have wild pets, because she felt that because it's all illegal now, unless it's like starlings, which is an exotic bird, so because you gain this feel, whether it's a pet raccoon or a pet starling or a pet whatever, that you don't get just by watching them in the wild, including a real insight into their behaviors. But it creates a bond in a sense, partly to the individual, like it might with a cat or a dog, but also to the natural world. So I think, and I tend to agree with her, it's a loss. But especially children can't do that.
Lisa?
I have maybe a sort of quirky question about your frames rather than about the paintings.
Okay.
I haven't known your work that long, right? But you use the same frame almost all of the time for every size painting. And the framing is beautiful. So I guess I have a two-part question. One, how long have you been using this particular frame? And two, what makes you decide in those rare moments, and I think I can guess the answer maybe for the coffee grinder, when you don't use this frame and you decide to use your own recycled antique frame on it?
Well, I'll answer that one first. My father loved antique frames and used them. I'm sorry, I can babble on and on. There was an antique dealer, Annie will know who this is, who lived south of Evansville by the name of Charlie Shannon. Charlie was a character, to say the least, and I'll leave it at that. But my father he was connected in the antique world, and he was constantly supplied my father with antique frames. And if he could get them, he used them. He did not. And so that's part of where I got sort of imprinted, if I can use that word, on using those old frames. But I think they're beautiful. And in some styles of paintings, I think they work very well. So that's the answer to that. The easy answer to the other ones is I like the black and gold. I think it does. You're right. It works with a lot, if not all, of my paintings. And I don't have to make framing decisions. And one of the very things I hated was when you would go into a frame shop or a dealer and there's 500 different moldings there, and I'm trying to pick out one that's going to work. And it's like, that's one thing to do that with one painting. It's another thing to do it day in and day out. There's actually 3 different moldings, not counting the old ones in this show, because they quit making them. And then they would make one that's similar, like this is different than some of the other ones, and this is one of the ones that I used to use, but they discontinued it, much to my chagrin. And, you know, so, and that will probably keep happening, but it's very, very frustrating. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. So this show is up through June 2nd. We also have 2 other shows in the gallery, Small Work Show, which has a whole range of really beautiful smaller paintings, and then up in gallery number 5 is a show called Sanctioned by Brooklyn artist Craig June Lee, and those shows are up as well through June 2nd. So thanks everybody, and thank you, Jonathan.